Next time, send someone appropriate. Richard Caldwell didn't even look at her when he said it, just pulled his hand back mid-gesture and reached for a linen napkin, wiping his fingers slowly as if the moment had left something behind, something he didn't want to carry into the deal. And the room followed his lead, not with words, but with silence, the kind that settles heavy over polished glass and tailored suits, the kind that tells you exactly where you stand without anyone needing to say it again. And Ava Brooks stood there for half a second longer than expected, her hand still slightly extended, not frozen, not trembling, just present, before she lowered it with quiet precision, her fingers brushing against the edge of the conference table as if grounding herself in something real, something solid. While the city stretched behind her through 40-foot windows, Manhattan sunlight cutting through steel and glass, catching on cufflinks and tablet screens, turning the room into something almost theatrical, almost staged, except nothing about this felt scripted, not the way Richard leaned back into his chair like he owned not just the building but the outcome, not the way a junior associate near the end of the table let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a laugh before catching himself, not the way someone whispered, barely audible, "She's just staff," like it explained everything, like it justified the distance, and Ava heard it. Of course she did, but her expression didn't change, didn't crack. Because she had heard worse in quieter places, in smaller rooms where power didn't need glass walls to prove itself, and she adjusted the folder in her hands instead, aligning its edges with the table's seam, the paper inside crisp, untouched, waiting, while Richard finally glanced up, not at her, but past her, already moving on, already dismissing the interruption as if it had never mattered. "Let's proceed," he said, voice even, controlled, the kind of tone that closed doors before they opened, and across the table pens lifted, screens lit, the deal inching forward like a machine that had never learned how to stop. But there was a flicker, subtle, almost invisible, in the reflection beneath Ava's hands, the way the light caught the glass just right, revealing not just the room but the tension beneath it, the small fractures and certainty that no one wanted to acknowledge. And Ava exhaled once, slow, measured, her shoulders settling as if she had just made a decision no one else could see. Because in rooms like this, power wasn't always loud, it wasn't always announced. Sometimes it stood quietly at the edge, underestimated, uninvited, waiting for the exact moment when silence would become something else entirely. The room moved on without her, or at least it pretended to, because that is what rooms like this are built to do, absorb disruption and smooth it over until it disappears, until the only thing left is momentum. And Ava Brooks stepped back from the table with quiet efficiency, not hurried, not hesitant, just precise, like someone who had learned long ago that attention could be a liability if you did not control it. And she adjusted the small black badge clipped to her blazer, the one that read, "Guest Coordinator" in thin white letters, a label simple enough to make people comfortable, simple enough to make them underestimate exactly how much she saw, because she had been in this building since before sunrise, before the elevators filled with polished shoes and rehearsed confidence, when the marble floors still held the echo of cleaning carts and low voices, when power had not yet fully arrived, but its infrastructure had already begun its quiet work. And she remembered the security guard at the front desk glancing at her ID for barely a second before waving her through, not out of trust, but out of habit, because people like her were expected to move quietly through spaces like this, to prepare them, to maintain them, to disappear once the real conversation began. And she had let that assumption settle around her like a coat, not resisting it, not correcting it, just wearing it until it served its purpose. Because invisibility, when chosen, could be more powerful than recognition. And now as she crossed to the side of the room, where a long console table held water pitchers and neatly arranged glasses, she reached for one, her fingers steady as she poured, the soft sound of water against crystal almost too quiet to notice, almost, but not entirely, because a woman seated near the center of the table glanced up for a brief moment, her eyes lingering just long enough to register something she could not quite name, something off about the way Ava held herself, the way her posture did not match the role printed on her badge. But the moment passed, dismissed just as quickly as it came, because the meeting demanded attention, because Richard Caldwell had begun outlining projections in a voice that filled the room without raising itself, calm, controlled, certain, the kind of certainty that did not invite interruption. And yet Ava listened, not casually, not passively, but with a level of focus that did not belong to someone assigned to refill glasses. Her gaze drifting not to the speaker, but to the documents projected across the screen, line items, funding structures, percentages that shifted depending on how you read them. And she recognized the pattern immediately, not because it was obvious, but because it was familiar, a structure designed to look balanced while quietly consolidating control, a framework that rewarded speed over scrutiny. And she had seen versions of it before in rooms that looked very different from this one, rooms without windows. Rooms where decisions were made in hours that never appeared on calendars, and her reflection flickered faintly in the glass surface of the table as she set the picture down, the city behind her blurring into light and movement. And for a moment she allowed herself to breathe, slow and even, because she understood exactly what was happening, exactly what would happen next if no one said anything, and exactly how little time remained before a signature would turn assumption into consequence. And across the room Richard's hand hovered over the document again, pen balanced between his fingers, the same hand that had just moments ago refused hers without a second thought. And something in that contrast settled into place, not anger, not urgency, but clarity, the kind that comes when every variable aligns into a single, undeniable truth. And Ava straightened slightly, her hand resting once more on the edge of the folder she had placed on the table earlier, her fingertips brushing its surface as if confirming it was still there, still real, because in the space between silence and action, there is always a choice. And she was no longer standing at the edge of the room, no longer just another presence designed to go unnoticed. She was waiting, measuring, choosing the exact second when being seen would no longer be optional but necessary. Richard Caldwell did not rush, and that was part of what made him dangerous in rooms like this. Because speed suggested uncertainty, but he had built a reputation on the opposite, on control so complete it looked effortless. And as he stood near the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair, the other holding the pen with deliberate ease, he spoke not to impress but to conclude, his voice low and steady, threading through the room with quiet authority as he outlined final projections, expected returns, strategic positioning across markets that stretched far beyond the skyline visible through the glass. And every number he mentioned carried weight, not because they were large, but because he delivered them like outcomes already decided, not possibilities still in motion. And the executives around him responded accordingly, nods timed, notes taken, agreement forming not through debate but through alignment, because Richard did not invite resistance. He absorbed it before it could take shape, and Ava watched this not from the center but from the margin, where perspective sharpened, where patterns revealed themselves without distraction, and she recognized the rhythm of his confidence, the cadence of someone who had closed deals so often that doubt had become unnecessary, almost irrelevant. And yet beneath that polished certainty there was something else, something quieter, hidden in the structure of the agreement now glowing across the wall. Size screen, a distribution of risk that leaned ever so slightly in one direction, subtle enough to pass unnoticed if you trusted the surface, if you trusted him, and most of them did, because Richard Caldwell had never given them a reason not to, at least not one they could prove, and he used that, not aggressively, not recklessly, but with precision, shaping the narrative of the deal the way an architect shapes a building, guiding attention toward what was visible while reinforcing what remained unseen. And Ava felt the shift in the room as it moved closer to completion, the air tightening in that familiar way that happens just before a signature, when conversation narrows and focus sharpens, when people stop questioning and start preparing to agree. And she saw the junior analyst from earlier straighten in his seat, his earlier uncertainty now replaced with quiet compliance, his pen poised above the page, waiting for the signal that it was safe to follow. And near the far end of the table a senior partner adjusted his glasses, scanning the final clause with a hesitation so brief it might have been imagined, before nodding once to himself and setting the document back down. Because in a room led by someone like Richard, hesitation rarely survived long enough to matter. And at the center of it all Richard stepped forward again, closing the distance between himself and the table, his reflection stretching across the glass surface. intersecting briefly with Ava's where she stood off to the side, a momentary overlap of presence that neither acknowledged. And he placed the pen down beside the contract with measured care, not yet signing, not yet finishing, but bringing everything to the edge of conclusion, and his gaze moved across the room, collecting silent confirmations, reading the subtle cues that told him he had already won, that the deal was his, that no one would challenge him now. And for a second longer than necessary, his eyes passed over Ava again, not seeing her, not really, just registering movement where none was expected, before dismissing it entirely. Because in his world she did not belong to this moment. She was part of the background, part of the system that allowed moments like this to exist without interruption, and that assumption settled into the room like a final piece of structure, invisible but absolute, and Ava felt it, not as pressure, not as limitation, but as confirmation, because the clearer the assumption, the sharper the break when it finally came, and her hand moved once more to the folder, not opening it, not yet, just resting there with quiet certainty, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, while across the table Richard reached for the pen again, his fingers closing around it with the calm confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. Ava did not raise her voice when she spoke, and that was what made it cut through the room, not volume but timing, because she chose the exact second before the pen touched paper, the exact moment when silence was already tightening around the decision, and her words entered that space clean and precise. You might want to review section 12 before you sign. And for a fraction of a second no one reacted, not because they did not hear her, but because their minds refused to place the voice where it came from, refused to connect it to the figure standing near the console table. And then the delay broke, subtle at first, a shift of posture, a glance exchanged between two executives, a faint tightening in Richard's grip on the pen, and he did not look up immediately, which in itself was a response, controlled, deliberate, as if acknowledging her too quickly would give the interruption more weight than it deserved. And when he finally did turn his head, it was slow, measured, his expression unchanged, his gaze landing on her with the same detached assessment he might give a misplaced object. That will not be necessary, he said, calm, final, already dismissing the moment before it could expand. But Ava did not move, did not step back into the role the room expected her to return to. Instead, she reached for the folder beneath her hand and slid it forward onto the table. The sound soft but distinct against the glass, and something in that sound shifted the air again. Because it was not the movement of someone unsure, it was the movement of someone certain, and a few heads turned now, not all, but enough to fracture the flow, enough to create a pause where there had been none, and Richard's eyes flicked briefly to the folder, then back to her, a trace of irritation surfacing, not loud, not obvious, but present. You are not part of this discussion, he said, each word controlled, contained, the kind of statement meant to re-establish order without escalating the situation. And for a moment it worked, the room leaning back toward him, toward the structure he had built, toward the assumption that this interruption would resolve itself the way all others had, quietly, without consequence. But Ava's posture did not change, her shoulders steady, her gaze level, and when she spoke again her voice carried the same calm as before, not defiant, not emotional, just clear. The funding structure reallocates liability after closing, not before. And this time the words landed differently, not as a challenge, but as information, specific, precise, and the difference was enough to disrupt the surface, enough to draw attention not to her position, but to the content of what she had said. And across the table one of the senior partners glanced back at the screen, his eyes narrowing slightly as he searched for the clause, and another executive shifted in his chair, uncertainty flickering where confidence had been, and Richard felt it, the subtle change in alignment, the way focus began to split, and his jaw tightened just enough to register the shift, because this was no longer just an interruption, it was a variable, and variables required control. That clause has been reviewed, he said, sharper now, not louder, but edged, his authority pressing back into the room, extensively. And for a second it seemed like the moment might close again, like the system would absorb this deviation the way it always had. But Ava did not retract, did not soften, her hand resting lightly on the folder she had placed between them, her fingertips tapping at once, almost imperceptibly, before she added, "Then you already know who holds the override." And that was when the room changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a series of small, undeniable shifts, eyes moving from her to the document, from the document to Richard, from Richard back to her, the silence returning, but this time it was different, not dismissive, not comfortable, but searching, and Richard's hand, still holding the pen, paused above the page, just long enough to break the illusion of inevitability, just long enough for doubt to enter the space he had controlled so completely only seconds before. The silence did not break this time. It stretched, thin and fragile, like something about to snap, and Richard Caldwell felt it before he acknowledged it. The shift in control so subtle it might have been dismissed in any other room. But not here, not now, because every eye had moved, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to fracture the alignment he had built, and his grip on the pen tightened, not visibly, not in a way that would give anything away, but enough that he placed it down. Instead of signing, the motion smooth, intentional, as if it had always been part of the plan, and he leaned back slightly, recalibrating, his gaze returning to Ava with a focus that was no longer dismissive, no longer distant, but measuring, assessing, searching for the exact point where this deviation could be contained. "Explain," he said, the word quiet, controlled, but carrying a weight that pulled the room back toward him. Because he was not asking out of curiosity, he was asking to regain ground, to reassert the structure. And for a moment it worked, the executives shifting their attention once more to him, waiting for the correction, the clarification that would restore certainty. But Ava did not rush to fill the space. She did not step forward or raise her voice. She simply opened the folder, the sound of paper moving against paper soft but precise, and turned it toward the center of the table, aligning it with the contract already in front of them. And that small act, that quiet alignment, did something the room could not ignore. It reframed the conversation, not as interruption, but as continuation, and one of the senior partners leaned in, just slightly, his eyes scanning the page she had revealed, his brow tightening as he followed the lines, cross-referencing what he saw with what had been projected moments earlier, and the first crack appeared, not in the numbers, but in the certainty. Because he did not nod this time. He paused, and that pause echoed, moving across the table in subtle ripples, a shift of posture here, a glance there, until it reached Richard again, and he saw it, felt it, the loss of momentum, the way the room no longer moved in unison with him, and irritation surfaced, sharper now, closer to the edge of something he rarely allowed himself to show. "This has already been reviewed by counsel," he said, his tone firmer, the words landing with intention, meant to close the gap that had opened. But the partner at the far end did not look up immediately, his attention still on the document, his fingers tracing a line of text, as if confirming something he did not want to be true. And when he finally did lift his head, it was not toward Richard, but toward Ava, a brief, searching look that carried a question he had not yet spoken. And in that moment the room tilted again, not dramatically, but enough that the center of gravity began to shift, and Richard saw it happening in real time. The controls slipping not through confrontation, but through doubt, through the quiet recognition that something might have been missed, and that possibility was more dangerous than any argument, because it could not be dismissed without proof, and proof required attention, and attention was no longer fully his, and he straightened in his chair, his voice tightening just enough to cut through the hesitation. "You are overstepping," he said, the words directed at Ava but meant for the room, a reminder of roles, of hierarchy, of the structure that had defined every moment up until now. And for a second it hung there, heavy, pressing against the silence, waiting to see if it would hold. But Ava did not retreat, did not apologize, her expression steady, her presence unchanged, and when she spoke again it was not to defend herself, not to challenge him directly, but to clarify the only thing that mattered. "The override is not in the primary clause," she said, her voice even, grounded. "It is in the secondary enforcement section, tied to the funding source." And the words landed with precision, not loud, not dramatic, but exact, and that was enough, because the partner nearest the screen turned back to it immediately, scrolling, searching, his movements quick now, urgent in a way they had not been before, and the room followed, attention shifting away from Richard for the first time, not out of defiance, but out of necessity, because uncertainty had taken hold, and Richard sat there, still, composed, but no longer in control of the moment the way he had been just minutes ago, the pen resting untouched beside his hand as the deal he had already claimed began, quietly, to unravel. The room did not speak. It breathed, slow and uneven, like something alive that had just realized it might be standing on unstable ground. And the soft hum of the city beyond the glass seemed louder now, the distant sound of traffic rising up 30 floors like a reminder that the world outside kept moving even as everything inside this room slowed to a near stop, and Ava Brooks stood exactly where she had been, her hands resting lightly at the edge of the table, her posture composed, not rigid, not defensive, just present, as if she had stepped into a space that had always been hers and was only now being acknowledged. And across from her the executives leaned forward one by one, not in unison, not dramatically, but in quiet increments, their attention narrowing onto the documents in front of them, fingers tracing lines, eyes scanning, rereading, recalculating, the subtle rhythm of doubt replacing the earlier rhythm of agreement. And no one laughed now, no one whispered, because the language had shifted from assumption to verification, and that shift carried weight, the kind that settled into shoulders and slowed breathing. And Richard Caldwell remained still, his hand resting near the pen but no longer reaching for it, his gaze fixed not on Ava but on the contract, as if by looking at it long enough he could bend it back into certainty. But the numbers did not change, the clauses did not realign. They remained exactly as they were, precise, structured, and now undeniably visible in a way they had not been minutes ago, and a faint reflection of his face appeared in the glass surface of the table, sharper now under the angle of the afternoon light, revealing something he rarely allowed to surface, not fear, not exactly, but recognition, the quiet understanding that control, once questioned, does not return easily. And near the far end of the table the senior partner cleared his throat, not loudly, just enough to mark a transition, and he adjusted his glasses again, this time with intention. "This clause," he said slowly, his voice measured, careful, as if each word needed to be placed correctly, "it ties enforcement to the originating capital." And he did not finish the sentence, he did not need to, because the implication settled into the room on its own, complete, undeniable. And another executive leaned closer, tapping the screen with a fingertip, scrolling back to confirm, and the soft tapping sound echoed in the quiet like a clock resetting itself, counting down not to agreement, but to realization. And Ava did not interrupt, did not guide them further. She allowed the silence to do its work, allowed the room to arrive at the truth on its own, because truth discovered carries more weight than truth delivered. And that was where her strength lay, not in forcing the moment, but in creating the space for it to unfold. And Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders shifting just enough to release the tension he had been holding. And for the first time since the meeting began, he looked directly at Ava, not past her, not through her, but at her, his gaze steady, searching, recalibrating. And in that look there was no dismissal, no assumption, only the quiet process of reassessment, as if he were seeing her not as she appeared, but as she was beginning to reveal herself to be. And the distance between them, measured in feet across a polished table, felt suddenly smaller, not physically, but in significance, because the hierarchy that had defined that distance had begun to dissolve, replaced by something less certain, less controlled, and more real. And the light shifted again across the room, sliding along the edges of the glass, catching on the open folder in front of Ava, illuminating the crisp lines of text that had gone unnoticed until now. And no one reached for their pen, no one moved to close the deal, because the moment had changed, not through volume, not through force, but through clarity. And in that clarity there was a pause, deep and undeniable, where power was no longer assumed, but questioned, and where silence no longer protected certainty, but revealed its absence. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, quiet and irreversible, as the senior partner's finger stopped mid-line and hovered there for a second too long, his eyes fixed on the claws that had been invisible just minutes ago. And then he leaned back slowly, the leather of his chair releasing a soft breath beneath him. "The override is not conditional," he said, more to the room than to anyone in particular, his voice low, almost disbelieving, and that single sentence moved through the space like a shift in gravity, pulling every remaining assumption down with it. And another executive turned fully toward the screen now, scrolling with more urgency, confirming, tracing the same path, arriving at the same conclusion, and one by one the room aligned again. But not behind Richard, not this time. They aligned with the truth laid bare in the document. And the structure that had once felt seamless now revealed its hidden hinge, the point where control did not belong to the visible authority at the head of the table, but to something deeper, something embedded in the foundation of the deal itself. And Richard Caldwell remained still, his posture unchanged, but the stillness meant something different now. It was no longer the stillness of control, it was the stillness of calculation, of a man recalibrating in real time. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, not weaker, but stripped of its earlier certainty. "Who holds the originating capital?" he asked, not looking at anyone else, only at Ava. And the room followed his gaze without being told, because the answer, though not yet spoken, had already begun to take shape in the silence between them. And Ava did not respond immediately. She let the question settle, let the weight of it expand until it filled the space completely, and then she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and placed a single card on the table, sliding it forward with the same measured precision she had shown from the beginning. The movement simple, almost understated, but impossible to ignore, and the card stopped at the center of the table, its white surface catching the light, the black lettering crisp and unambiguous. And for a second no one moved, as if the room itself needed permission to acknowledge what lay in front of them. And then the senior partner leaned in again, closer this time, his hand extending slowly, picking up the card between his fingers, and his eyes scanned it once, then again, more carefully, before lifting toward Ava with a look that carried no doubt, no hesitation, only recognition. And he placed the card back down with deliberate care, turning it slightly so the others could see. And the name faced them all now, clear, undeniable, Ava Brooks, founder, Brooks Capital, and beneath it, in smaller print, the line that changed everything: lead underwriter, $2 billion allocation. And the silence that followed was not confusion, not tension, but clarity, the kind that settles deep and leaves no room for interpretation. And Richard's gaze did not leave the card, his eyes tracing the letters as if confirming they would not shift under scrutiny. And something in his expression softened, not in defeat, but in understanding. Because this was no longer a negotiation of terms, it was a recognition of reality. And he exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, deliberate, as he leaned back in his chair, his hand moving away from the pen entirely, leaving it where it rested on the table, untouched. And when he looked up again, it was not with dismissal, not with authority, but with a level of attention that had been absent before. And in that moment the roles within the room had shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through truth, revealed at exactly the right time, by someone who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. No one spoke for several seconds after the card settled on the table, not because they did not know what it meant, but because they did, completely, and the weight of that understanding required space, required silence to fully land. And Ava Brooks did not move to fill it. She simply stood there, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged from the moment she first entered the room, as if nothing about this revelation altered who she was, only how she was seen. And that difference carried more power than any declaration could have. And across from her, Richard Caldwell shifted forward slightly in his chair, not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough to signal intention. And his eyes lifted from the card to meet hers again, this time without distance, without dismissal, just focus, clear and deliberate. And he reached for the pen once more, not to sign, but to move it aside, placing it parallel to the contract, as if resetting the moment entirely, as if acknowledging that the version of this deal that had existed minutes ago no longer applied. And his voice, when he spoke, carried a different tone now, still controlled, still composed, but grounded in something more real, more measured. It appears we have been operating with incomplete visibility, he said, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as a statement of fact, and the room listened differently now, not leaning toward him automatically, but considering, weighing, and Ava met his gaze without resistance, without triumph, just presence, because for her this was never about winning the room. It was about correcting it, and Richard's hand moved slowly across the table, stopping just short of the space between them, not extending fully, not yet, but close enough that the intention was clear. Ms. Brooks, he continued, using her name for the first time, each syllable placed with care. It seems I misjudged both your role and your position in this transaction. And the words hung there, simple, direct, carrying more weight than any elaborate apology could have, because they acknowledged the truth without attempting to reshape it. And Ava glanced briefly at his hand, then back to his eyes, her expression calm, unchanged, and for a moment the room held its breath again, not in tension, but in anticipation of what would follow, and she stepped forward just enough to close the distance, not fully, not immediately, her movement measured, intentional, and when she spoke her voice remained as steady as it had been from the beginning. The structure is not flawed, she said quietly, her gaze steady, but the assumptions around it were, and the statement did not challenge him, it clarified the moment, separating the deal from the perception that had nearly compromised it. And Richard nodded once, slowly, absorbing the distinction, because it allowed the conversation to move forward without erasing what had happened, and that mattered, more than saving face, more than restoring control, and his hand remained where it was, open, not demanding, not entitled, simply offered, and after a brief pause Ava extended her own, meeting his with the same precision she had shown throughout, the contact brief, firm, not symbolic, but real, and when their hands parted it was not a return to what had been. It was the beginning of something different, a recalibrated understanding that did not rely on hierarchy or assumption, but on clarity, and around them the room shifted once more, but this time the movement felt grounded, intentional, as executives straightened in their seats, documents were adjusted, and attention returned to the table with a new awareness of what was at stake, not just in terms of numbers or control, but in terms of how easily both could be misread, and the light outside had softened slightly, the angle of the sun, changing just enough to cast longer reflections across the glass, stretching the outlines of everyone in the room into something more fluid, less defined. And in that reflection Ava stood not at the edge, not in the background, but at the center of a moment that had finally aligned with the truth it had been built on all along. The room did not return to what it had been. It settled into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried awareness of what had almost been missed, and the contract lay open between them, no longer a formality, no longer a conclusion waiting to happen, but a document being seen clearly for the first time, and Richard Caldwell sat with his hands resting lightly on the table, no longer reaching, no longer directing, simply present in the same space as everyone else, his earlier certainty replaced not with hesitation, but with attention, the kind that listens before it speaks, and Ava Brooks closed the folder slowly, aligning its edges with the contract once more, her movements unhurried, precise, as if the outcome had never been in question, only the timing of its recognition. And across the table the senior partner nodded once, subtle but firm, signaling not agreement with a person, but agreement with the truth now visible to all of them. And another executive adjusted the figures on the screen, the projections shifting slightly, recalibrated to reflect the structure as it actually existed rather than how it had been assumed, and the numbers settled into place with a quiet finality, no longer leaning, no longer disguised, just balanced. And the silence that followed was not heavy, not tense, but resolved, the kind of silence that comes after clarity, when nothing more needs to be forced, and Richard reached for the pen again, this time without hesitation, his fingers closing around it with a steadiness that came from understanding rather than control, and before he signed he glanced once more at Ava, not for permission, not for validation, but as acknowledgement, a brief meeting of eyes that carried more meaning than any words spoken earlier. And then he lowered the pen to the page and completed the signature in a single, smooth motion. the ink settling into the paper like a quiet confirmation that the deal, now fully understood, could finally move forward, and one by one the others followed. Signatures added not out of momentum, but out of alignment, each stroke deliberate, considered, and when it was done the documents were gathered, the folders closed, and the room began to shift again, chairs sliding back, screens dimming, the structure of the meeting dissolving into the next phase of action. But Ava did not linger. She did not step forward to claim attention or remain to receive it. Instead, she turned toward the glass wall, her reflection stretching across its surface as she moved, the city beyond now, softened by the late afternoon light, buildings catching the sun in long, golden lines that blurred their edges. And she walked toward the door with the same quiet presence she had carried from the beginning, her steps measured, unhurried, the sound of them barely audible against the carpet. And no one stopped her, no one called her back, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to prove. And as she reached the doorway, Richard's voice did not follow, not because he had nothing to say, but because some moments are not meant to be filled. And she stepped out into the hallway where the light was cooler, the air quieter, the hum of the building returning to its usual rhythm, and the door closed softly behind her, leaving the room in a silence that felt different from the one it had started with, a silence that no longer concealed assumptions, but held the quiet weight of a lesson learned without being spoken. And inside, for a brief moment longer, Richard remained seated, his gaze drifting to the space where Ava had stood, not with regret, not with pride, but with recognition, the kind that stays long after the room has emptied, while outside the city continued its steady motion, unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all, except for the subtle shift in one room high above it, where power had not been taken or given, but simply revealed for what it truly was.